This is about the Michigan settlement, which was essentially how it was perceived as the lawyers who represented all the states, and particularly the ones in Mississippi. Essentially, you're talking about Dick Scruggs and his law firm. In Michigan, it was Scruggs Millett, and that would include Bozeman and all the partners. And they represented, I think, 17, 18 states, and I'm not really sure about that, but I will find that out. And the particular elements of this include how Mike Moore, who was the official Attorney General of Mississippi, officially became also the PR agent for the collection of these outside counsel fees. And believe me, if you read any of the arbitration results, which were, kind of devious to begin with, the man who's most responsible for this was the principal arbitrator, Mr. Calhoun, which, you got to be suspicious of a name like that, but it was John Calhoun Wells, and and the concept was simply to collect the money and to make the appearance. And when you made the appearance, you had a certain way of approaching the three-party panel of arbitrators. And having read a few of these, and particularly the one in Michigan, it's the penultimate of the kind of settlement that you are winding down. And when I first read the Michigan settlement, I came to the conclusion that the outside counsel, which was Dick Scruggs and Ron Montley, had apparently never even gone to Michigan, and other than they sent their briefs or their pleadings, and yet there was no complaint whatsoever, because this old geezer who'd been Attorney General for 37 years was very, very much in touch, so he said, over the phone with these people. And what is fascinating is you get the thread of how much money was distributed, and a lot of lawyers had complained about how this was being divvied up. It was something that the tobacco companies also complained about, and I don't know whose idea this was, but the binding arbitration was how they did it. So the first were in places like Iowa and Ohio. It looks like the list that I saw the other day from a somewhat clandestine piece from the annals of Brown and Williams' files, which I found and misspelled in my name. I'm still looking into that, but Moore, as Attorney General, traveled apparently with Dick Scruggs. I don't see any representation of Motley, but with Dick Scruggs and Lowell Bergman apparently around to these various states. I think Lowell Bergman was invited because he was the PR arm who represented the quote movie stars that were being launched at least around that time in a grossly over budgeted and failed movie, but nevertheless it was based on some some facts and a lot of fiction. And I know because I somehow got involved with a roundabout way of giving up some of my own particular knowledge and to these people. It was put into HBO and to front line, of which the principal party was Lowell Bergman, and everywhere Lowell Bergman went, there had to be something that you were selling. You know, he was the full of brush man. He was the snake poison man. He was the man who he led the band. And you know, in truth, I don't think that there's ever been a better Laurel and Hardy trip than group duo than Bergman and Moore. As the Minnesota people used to say about Mike Moore, I'm not going to join that circus, but for Mike Moore, this was the principal achievement and at least the pinnacle of his achievement. Gathering money, not for Mississippi. No, it wasn't for Mississippi. It was for his assistants. Now, I don't know how you get around this. Legally, it sounds a little bit different to the norm, but I recall how interesting it was. And when you read these things, you have to really understand that there's so many holes in this that he had to fill in each one, and Mike Moore was the principal agent or the principal exponent of how this got into the panel, how it was explained, and then somehow Lowell Bergman would get in there. And so let me just point out a couple of things. First, the how it touches upon me and how I will explain it is there's a concept that is so distorted that was distorted from the moment I somehow got involved with these lawn shows here, and the reality was, you know, whatever you did, you couldn't succeed. Whatever you did, you were going to be someone was going to tell you it was rain, and you realized that it was not rain that was going down your leg. But one of the things that intrigues me is in reading this beatific description of how Moore explains things to the panel is under the topic of defense of whistleblowers. And remember, he's trying to generate up some money for Scruggs and Motley, and they apparently haven't even been in the state of Michigan, and this is not the first day. So, but you have an ancient warrior in the Attorney General's office who's been Attorney General for 37 years, and here's how this is explained by this antiquity of Attorney Generals. Who is from Michigan, and of course he's the one who brings in, he tethers himself to, they more or less have a Xerox machine and they're copying everything, which is what they would do. I mean, there's no problem. He describes the defense of whistleblowers, and as I said in the other tape, there was a lead into that. And so here we have the Michigan payout to the lawyers, which is $450 million. And there has to be some reason for it. So these are, I mean, you know that they're going to give out this money, but they're giving it out to perfect strangers, so to speak, who happen to draw them into this. But Mike Moore was at the peak of his career, and so what they call is Scruggs brought forth and nurtured and protected, and in defense of this, the whistleblowers. Now, I have to count this on my fingers because, and basically stop at two. I can't really go to beyond that. But they probably had some idea of a different picture. I don't know, but from what I could tell, this nurturing was totally not in my direction. I didn't see any protection. I mean, if you're talking about protection, what kind of protection? Well, I know that they had all this hype and PR relations to someone else, the diva. But protecting, in this sense, I quote, protecting the whistleblowers from the flurry of the legal assaults. Excuse me, but in reality, whatever happened on the side of Wygant was brought about by Dickie Scruggs and his violation, and since he was an agent of Mike Moore, obviously whatever he did with Wygant, I'm going to suppose that is attached to the agency relationship between Mike Moore. And so when he drags him from virtually the courtroom and the order, which was the same order that I had years before, brings him down to Mississippi, and then puts him in this circus, which has been set up by Lowell Bergman and the PR people. It's just phenomenal. But you know what you see is what you paid for. Now you're setting up a whole bunch of press people to cover you, and this is exactly what this whole lawsuit was about. PR, as Mike Moore says, and politics. That was all over the place. And then you had the law, but the law was pretty much secondary, because by the time you pulled all these things, yes, you created problems and lawsuits, and you know, there was violations of injunctions and that sort of thing, which did befall Jeffrey Wygant because of obviously what Mike Moore was up to and what Dickie Scruggs did to Jeffrey Wygant. As to me, as to my own position, I can say that you know, there was absolutely nothing that these people down here in Mississippi, this little cadre of I tend to think of a small platoon of warriors from the Mexican-American War. They were not interested in Louisville, and yet everything they got came from Louisville. Most of everything, including some of the briefs and all of the material that the fine firm of the associating or Alan Morrison's firm. I'm sure they gleaned whatever they could whenever they could, but there was no protection. I can't think of one incident where there was any kind of protection that wasn't attached to something that they were interested in. I mean, for the largest time, all I could see was their personal interest and their strikingly contrasted interest in how to build up another case or another problem here and there, and embarrass the tobacco companies wherever they could. And then they had their opportunities to make embarrassing statements, which I've totally corrected here and will continue to. And I had basically the interest, not the heart, but the interest in maintaining whatever was thrown at me. And so this kind of thing was introduced to the arbitration panel. 3 members, one was chosen by the tobacco companies, but the others were chosen by the people who were going to give evidence of how well they performed in order to build up the sum of $450 million as the payoff to Dick, Scruggs, and to Ron Motley. So the first concept that was introduced was in this panel of arbitration was that Scruggs defended the whistleblowers. Well, that's got to be two people, and he certainly didn't defend anybody in Louisville. And as for the assault on Wygant and all the other things, a lot of this was just it was premeditated by conjuring up staged events. Certainly the event in Pascagoula, which is God knows how many vans were there for all of this. And what did he do? He simply said, yeah, they deal with Comerin, and it was basically a hearing which upset the people in Kentucky, but it was a bunch of lawyers yelling at each other, which was certainly dramatic. I mean, if you look at what goes on, it was very dramatic, interesting. Well, to take one of these events and say there was defense of whistleblowers is an obvious error of. In my case, there was nothing but terror, and the only person who defended me was in Louisville, Fox de Moise, and the press to some extent. There was a great deal of effort, certainly in '94, to make an effort to put a quietus on some of this, and to put a different face on it, because it was entirely different. What was going on in Louisville was not stolen documents. It was about what you could do, and obviously in Kentucky it was a completely different face. So to extract from Scruggs and Motley's appeal to the arbitrators in this panel in Michigan, and quoting the Scruggs and Motley spent considerable time and money protecting and defending these whistleblowers. I got two words to say. I don't know whether it's appropriate, but one of them begins with bull, and the other one you can imagine. And then it says that all the suits were dropped against Jeffrey Wygant and others. Come on. It was by hook and crook that I took Dickie Scruggs finally to the table. And as far as getting things to drop, Jeffrey Wygant had a golden goose from the very beginning. And there were very little problems that he had to deal with. I can't think of many. Any were brought about by himself or in the context of Dickie Scruggs' staging. And so the events and time and money, that's malarkey. Jeez, wow. The information, it was so broadly misinformation. Anyway, the lawyers didn't risk anything. And this is the whole point. They're sitting there in front of these arbitrators who know that they're going to get a percentage of whatever is given. And that's the deal. So come on, give us some more. And so just extracting this one thing from the Michigan hearing and saying, what a staged event this is. And Mike Moore's right in the middle of it. Then little Bergman is there too. He was flying around with him. Wait a minute. Wasn't Mike Moore the Attorney General of Mississippi? Was this part of his job? I didn't look in that book about Attorney General's job and traveling around and building up funds for his friends. That's exactly what it is. I don't think it's in the job description, but there was considerable levity. He was popular. And interestingly enough, Lowell Bergman took the same ride in his jet in San Francisco, landing there, and in Michigan, the hearing before the panel. Lowell Bergman goes into these pensive thoughts about how justified it would be to receive enormous amounts of money for Scruggs and for Motley, because, gee, this was so right. Jeffrey got freed. Freed from what? Jesus Christ. There's nothing in there. I just can't imagine. Read the transcripts. Read those lawsuits. I know he did have a bit of a hard time, but so did Stanton Glantz out there with his stolen documents. Had a hard time. It was certainly emotionally disturbing, but this statement alone is just hyperbolic by Lowell Bergman. He says, I don't think without Scruggs' help that Jeff couldn't have survived. Okay. And then as an afterthought, he says, neither Merrill Williams, misspelled M-E-R-R-I-L-L. Whoa, I'm beginning to see that little note again. Why do they continue after so many years to well, it's interesting, but Lowell Bergman's there, and then this is the most important narrative where it's obvious that Mike Moore didn't understand law. He did not understand if you interfere with a court order, no matter where it is in the United States, you're actually taking this upon yourself. Mike Moore was interfering in several court orders, but in my case, it was definitely a court order. And so he says, part of the reason that you should give my friends $450 million was that they disseminated the damaging documents. Now, let me first say that they were infamous documents, and when I had them, and then when they promised but stole and distributed them, they were no longer infamous. But here's what really gets me, because Mike Moore is saying that the Merrill Williams document spelled correctly. Oh no, it's not really. He claims that these documents were taken to, quote, the Ralph Nader's bunch, as though Ralph Nader was some kind of cheetah, and he had a group of animal farm people out there. You're talking about an icon of history and an icon of a consumer. And, well, you know what? Ralph Nader's group, or Ralph Nader's bunch, never saw these documents. Of course they didn't. This would have been illegal, unlawful. And Alan Morrison, who was definitely that started the litigation group with Ralph Nader, wasn't going to look at any documents because this was not legal. Mike Moore didn't have any problem with it whatsoever. So, by default, by reason, we have to say that Mike Moore, who was carrying around a couple of documents in his hip pocket, as I understand it, not only was violating the law and the court's law, and this is just so obvious, and he admits it. Here he's stating it, that those disseminated documents that we disseminated, they were turned down by the Ralph Nader bunch. That's not true. That's not true. So he lied to the arbitration panel. And it may be an innocent lie, but it's not to me. It's not to Ralph Nader, and it's not to the bunch. It's not the Brady bunch we're talking about here. They're skilled lawyers, and certainly more capable than you will ever find in your own little Christmas stocking. Then it says, these documents that were infamous and me when I had them, but they became famous after that when he had them and disseminated them, also ended up in the hands of CBS and NBC. How did that happen? Well, I didn't do it, you know. And then the Washington Post. Well, I didn't do it there either. Now, it is true that by virtue of the fact that Mike Moore flew with Dickie Scruggs in his Learjet to Washington and gave them to the staffers at Henry Waxman the Ugly's office. And of course, they somehow got in the hands of Phil Phillips, New York Times. Obviously, this happened, but lying about Ralph Nader's bunch is just an outrage. And yet, that's the kind of person who went to Ole Miss, graduated at a time when you didn't have to pass the bar, and you probably missed some of the ethics. You were violating a court order, as I've said before, and will say again. And no question about it. You were encouraging me and aiding and abetting. Whatever the law is, Ralph Nader and Ralph Nader's group did not violate it. He's far too superior man, and they are far too superior to you. And then he makes a claim that nobody would do anything. I have to admit, I made this claim too. I realized that years ago when I was with Morton Mintz, and the stakes were high, but individuals couldn't do this. And I do hand it to Dick Scruggs for being abandoned. There's no question about it. This bandito quality is sort of important. I hand it to him that he had that initiative, that he did this. But I certainly don't think that this is enhancing any kind of moral directive for an arbitration panel to give him more money. And where was I? Was I called for this? No, but was I told this is what's going to happen? Yeah. Anyway, Moore's right. Yeah, there were very few people who could get there, but this was years ago, before anybody had an opportunity. And the right place was Congress. And that's what was said back in 1991 by Richard Daynard when he met with me. Leave it on the doorstep, whatever. And that's exactly what was done. But carrying it that further step was not done. And I think that the provisions of violating the law and the dissemination of this information didn't bother these people at all, because they weren't good lawyers and they weren't ethical lawyers. There's nothing in the books that says you have to be ethical if you're dealing with, as Mike Moore explains it, the crimes that he could see. Well, I could see the crimes too. So could Fox, without looking at the documents, though. So could Alan Morrison. So could anyone who had anything to do with looking at them, as Richard Daynard did very early on. He said, "Look, I don't know how this is going to turn out." And, you could see the yellow streak in, but there again, he had no real way of carrying this out. So he did one thing: he turned it over to another person. So Moore, in continuing his pleading before the arbitration board, says that he takes credit. We fought them to we brought them the whistleblowers. We brought them to us. These lawyers and myself, my team, me. There's a little Napoleonic complex here. But he actually states that we stole them in so many words, disseminated them in so many words. There's no question about it. That's exactly what happened. And you're looking at a man who's making the judgment that this is an evidence of a crime. As I said in my tape with the Mike Moore meeting, hey, wait a minute, we've got an order here. And then it builds to the point where he's thumbing through the documents on one Sunday, and I'm looking at it saying, well, there's obviously no problem for these guys. So he takes credit for all of this, and then he builds up the fee settlement, at least in Michigan and in other states. This is sort of the script that he was using, and he immediately took these documents, now famous, formerly infamous when they were with me, famous Williams documents. Boy, that's a lawsuit that Stanton Glantz wrote a book about. Yeah, well, I wrote one too, but it was in those documents that you stole. So, I'm sure Stanton Glantz got a little head start there with that book, which was really well written and documented. All you had to do was take some of the footnotes and go through it. I think that this is just a monster concept of how egregious and how greedy and how, at the time he was very popular. But looking back 12 years now, and you can say that since the settlement was such a miserable failure, 12 years, and you did nothing, what are you trying to achieve now? And, I'm sure there are people that are living off the fat of the land. No question about it. There's an obvious indication that this doesn't stop, but there's only a certain amount of money that can be distributed every year, and as far as the lawyers go, and yet there's just so much pride in here in what he's saying, and so many holes that would cause me to think that he was certainly using me. I mean, Jeffrey Wigand, he mentions for sure through Lowell Bergman, but he's mentioning how important those documents were, and to me, the team was solely dependent on that. He's mentioning how important it was to Stanton Glantz. He's stating that all of these things led to the conclusion that this was the evidence that was going to kill tobacco and make them come to the table. That's what he says. The documents put the pressure on the industry. These documents, the infamous, in my hands, Merrill Williams documents, the famous documents after they got loose into everybody else's hands. So he's not only saying what the value is. The value is clearly $450 million. That's it. Because as I realized, this just in this one state, all these pleadings or whatever pleadings were made were minimal, and whatever was done in Michigan was de minimis. They simply did it from the Pascagoula office or the South Carolina office or whatever. Very little in-house, in-town dealing. A lot of phone calls, as this somewhat aging Attorney General states. But the documents put the pressure on the industry, came to terms to negotiate. What better claim do you have than to state that he's using all the information that states how significant those documents, the Brown Williams or Williams documents, infamous or famous, how important it was to negotiate, to get the law firms to negotiate. And of course, this is something we all know. There's no question about it. He doesn't discuss you know, the diva, that much. There's very little except what can be added through little Bergman. He discusses his team. He discusses the facts. But these documents, once he stole them and disseminated them, had a dramatic upset on the things that he wanted, the things that he did, public opinion, and pressured the resolution. How interesting. Now, there are some references also in this spiel to the arbitrators, which, remember, this is not just one state. This is Michigan. And the other states that Mike Moore represented for Dick Scruggs and for Ron Motley, 17 or 18. And I think those are the mysterious misspelled ones. I'm not sure. I know that New York, New Jersey, well, certainly Michigan. But in any case, he doesn't give absolute credit, but enough where you would give 90% credit, you know, for this. And then he comes to more goes to the defecation or the defection of the ligate, and then he comes to these. He just doesn't say anything, but somehow he equates all these people with somehow movie star roles as whistleblowers. Jeffrey Wigand, Ian Udis. I have no idea who he is, but you know, if you didn't know who he was, and I know most of the people, I knew all the people. So Bill Ferroni was the Rat Man. Jerome Rivers is probably Joan Rivers' daughter or something. I don't know. So I don't know these people, and yet the panel probably didn't need to know them after hearing his spiel on from Lowell Bergman and from him about the documents and me. So the panel was charged with putting up the money of $450 million. They just moved on. Scruggs and the others had reached their point. And that's the end of the story, I think. And there you are.